So later this summer, as part of Sorrento Center's 60th anniversary programming, Bishop Anna and I will explore a kind of theological then and now with the group that gathers. We've been collecting up some classics about what was sort of happening theologically and spiritually in the church and in the world 60 years ago. And we'll consider how those things sound now and how things have evolved. For instance, on April 16th, 1963, 60 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote an open letter to fellow clergymen from his cell in Birmingham City Jail. He was responding to a recent statement by a group of clergy calling his, quote, present activities unwise and untimely. Those present activities were, of course, direct action protests against segregation in the latter-day heat of the civil rights movement. I'm not actually going to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s whole letter, even though it's actually really tempting to do that. But I recommend strongly that you go home and do so. It's really easy to find online. Just Google letter from Birmingham jail. I actually think it should be required reading for anyone who chooses to call themselves Christian. It is a full and pretty challenging explanation of what Jesus might have meant when he says today, do not think I have come to bring peace to the earth. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, King wrote to the 8 white clergymen who wrote a statement titled A Call for Unity. But your statement, King continues, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. He goes on to describe the steps of a nonviolent campaign for justice, recognizing that such nonviolent campaigns can in fact lead to violence, because lamentably, King explains, it is an historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. After expanding on this reality, King gets to what might be his most challenging observation, writing, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the Proud Boys or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. King goes on, and as I said, I hope you Google it. You might have a phone in your pocket right now, and you can just go ahead and Google it and keep reading. Just tune me out, do that. I'm gonna go on, but nothing I have to say is more important than what King wrote. While King was organizing and protesting with hundreds of thousands of others and writing these theological treatises from jail cells, something quite different was happening in those white moderate churches. One icon of it, I think, was a Time magazine cover, April 8th, 1966, that provocatively asks, is God dead? In a recent podcast, I heard a celebrated preacher and writer, Barbara Brown Taylor, refer to that Time magazine cover in relationship to the movement of the last 60 years, particularly in white moderate Christianity, the movement from the death of God to the emptying of the churches. With that perspective and benefit of hindsight, we can trace the trajectory of these varying streams of theology and practice. In the early 21st century, a study of youth spirituality in the United States called the National Study of Youth and Religion. In the study, it was found that most teenagers at the time have, quote, a positive view of religion, but otherwise don't give it much thought. Now, while this has surely shifted and changed in the 20 years since the study, it still helps inform where we're at. Based on the results of the study, former youth pastor and one of the researchers, Kenda Creasy Dean, wrote a book titled Almost Christian: What the Faith of Our Teenagers is Telling the American Church. Dean contends that we have, quote, successfully convinced teenagers that religious participation is important for moral formation and for making nice people. But these young people possess no real commitment to or excitement about religious faith. She further argues that the, quote, blasé religiosity of most teenagers is not the result of poor communication, but the result of excellent communication of a watered down gospel. She goes on to ask hard questions, like as if that wasn't hard enough. What if the church models a way of life that asks not passionate surrender, but ho-hum assent? One of the core problems she names is theological. More than finding the right method or program, the issue requires a cultural change where churches teach young people by themselves practicing a, quote, consequential faith, a faith that matters enough to issue in a distinctive identity and way of life. This identity and way of life does not have to equate to a theology espousing Christian exclusivism, a personal morality mostly about sex, and an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific literalist view of Scripture. We often think that's what it means, but it can also mean claiming who we are as followers of the risen Christ, robustly and passionately, by fearlessly asking big questions, by graciously debating how now we believe, and by being willing to be theologically and otherwise thrown off center when grace and love call for it. And perhaps most importantly, by courageously moving beyond seeking a negative peace, by at best holding on to and at worst demanding an absence of tension, to instead fighting for a positive peace with its presence of justice, no matter how uncomfortable. Have no fear of them, Jesus repeats today. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Do not be afraid. Far from a faith of ho-hum assent to a watered down gospel, Jesus issues us a call to courageous confession, to follow in Jesus' way of loving sacrifice above all else. Do not think I have come to bring peace to the earth. Fully committing to following Jesus' way means, ironically, turmoil and loss. It means conflict, likely with those closest with us. It's parents and children finding themselves on opposite sides of issues like segregation, like equal marriage, like changing our understanding of pronouns, climate change, and the church's support and participation in the oppression of Indigenous peoples all over the world and right here in Victoria. 60 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. reflected in his letter from Birmingham jail, challenging the church mightily, writing, "If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century." Not hard to imagine why King was murdered, kind of like Jesus. Many powerful people are mightily threatened by such passionate commitment to the ways of God, described today by Jesus. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it.